It's my privilege to welcome you to the annual John Gandel Symposium on the Middle East. And this year, we are not going to discuss the Iranian threat. We are not going to discuss the transfer of the Scud missiles from Syria to Hezbollah. These are serious threats. But it was David Ben-Gurion who said many years ago in the early 50s that the future of Israel depends on its might, its military might, and on its right cause, on its legitimacy. And indeed, Israel is the strongest country in this region. But for the last several years, we witness a vicious campaign that is aimed at the legitimacy, at the right of Israel to exist as a democratic and Jewish state here in this region. And the purpose of this symposium today is to discuss how serious this threat is. What should we do about this threat, and how can we defeat those who want to attack us? The panelists of today, there is no need to introduce Professor Itamar Rabinovich, Professor Alan Dershowitz, and Daniel Taub. They are all leading scholars and diplomats who engage themselves in this bitter war, bitter struggle against the new enemies of Israel, in the media, in the academy, in some of the foreign ministry, in the so-called intellectual community, in some countries who put us and aimed us. Since, unlike discussion on the Iranian threats, which is mainly theoretical for most of you, this is something that has to do with any one of us who is present in this symposium. So we thought that it's better to have some introductory comments from the participants, from the panelists, and then to open this symposium to questions, answers, and comments, because not only our panelists are soldiers in this bitter war, but any one of you. That's how we feel here in Israel, in the campus in Tel Aviv University. So we'll first hear a few short comments, and then we'll turn this symposium to an open and free discussion. Our first speaker is Professor Itamar Rabinovich, former president of Tel Aviv University, former Israeli ambassador to Washington, but for me, my professor. So, Itamar.
Thank you, Eyal. Good morning. Eyal defined me as his professor. He's my student, and I'm proud to say that he is the Dean of Humanities elect. So as of this summer, this is the new Dean of Humanities. It's a pleasure for me to be together here with three friends on the podium. A couple of brief words about Ellen and Daniel. In 1970, my wife and I were graduate students in California, and we were watching television. There was a program called The Advocates, in which a very young law professor at Harvard Law School called Ellen Dershowitz debated with Roger Fisher, who was a very senior professor, a Quaker, an anti-Israeli professor, very sophisticated, and we were very much impressed by how this young man had both the courage and the brains to do well against Roger Fisher, and, you know, the rest is history. Daniel Taub came to Israel from England. He's a lawyer, a legal advisor in the foreign ministry. 10 years ago, as a chairman of the Wexner program in Israel, I had the privilege of participating in a decision to send him to the Kennedy School to get a Master of Public Policy supported by the Wexner Foundation, and Daniel became the valedictorian of his class at the Kennedy School. And it's very comforting to know that our foreign ministry, given the challenges that we will be talking about, has individuals like Daniel on its staff. Now, as to the subject matter, some of you may have come here from London or from Zurich. You may have noticed that when you check into Eyal at Terminal 1 in Heathrow, the check-in counter for Eyal is at the very end of the terminal. If you do the same thing in Zurich, you'll also find that the check-in counter for Eyal is at the very end of the terminal. We know why. If there is a shooting incident, some terrorist attack, let it be at the edge of the terminal, minimize the number of innocent bystanders who would be attacked. But it also has a symbolic statement with it. So Israel is almost at the edge of the cliff. One more push, and it's off the cliff. Because what I would like to argue briefly here is that the purpose of the campaign to delegitimize Israel is to do a repeat of the South Africa exercise, to ostracize Israel, delegitimize it, and bring it to the point at which the state of Israel as we know it would be replaced by what is euphemistically known as the one-state solution. Now, I'm not suggesting that there is some dark chamber somewhere in Moscow or in Europe or in Tehran where a sophisticated group is sitting, scheming, and organizing one international campaign. It's not as well organized as that, but there is an organized campaign, and this is the ultimate purpose of that campaign, just to delegitimize us to the point at which 10, 15 years from now, if nothing changes, there is an equal number of Jews and Arabs between the Jordan and the sea, or a larger number of Arabs between the Jordan and the sea than Jews, and the argument would be in one vote, and no more the state of Israel as we know it. This is nourished by a number of developments. One is the transition in the intellectual discourse in the world for more than a decade now into a human rights discourse. And we were very slow at recognizing this, and our adversaries were much quicker than us, and they have been using this human rights discourse to their advantage and to our disadvantage. Second is the globalization. The fact that you're now in a court in Madrid, Brussels, go and file a complaint against an Israeli politician or a Chinese politician or a Chilean politician and have a standing in a court has been used again in a very sophisticated manner, so that former Foreign Minister Tzipi Livni and several former generals in the IDF, for instance, cannot go to London now because they would be prosecuted. The idea that in the London case, this is organized by a former Israeli, a certain Mr. Machover, no comfort, but the fact is that they cannot go to London, and the fact is that the British government does precious little about it. They might have been doing something. They used the Dubai incident in order to step off that effort. And we see it everywhere. We see it in the academy. We see it in culture, where Israeli chamber music group is interrupted. We see it in the academy, when a boycott is spreading after all. We see it in the University of California, Irvine, where the ambassador of Israel cannot give a speech without being violently interrupted. And so the message is spreading that there is something illegitimate about Israel and Israelis to be operationalized later on. So here's the challenge. What do we do about it? 3 brief suggestions. One is there should be an organized effort by the state. The state can use NGOs, it doesn't have to do it directly, but it has to come from the government and has to be organized in a centralized, effective way. And we have to build a team, quote unquote, a legal commando to fight with all of this. There are so many gifted lawyers, academic practitioners, and other smart speakers, people who understand the law, who know the discourse, can be mobilized, and fight against it. Number two, use the same globalization networks that are being exploited against Israel to work for Israel. For instance, we know that the famous Israel Apartheid Week is conducted in universities around the globe, is financed by NGOs, by foundations. If you look very closely, you'll find that a certain Swedish foundation, which is financing this campaign in a certain university in England or in the United States, actually is being financed by the Swedish Foreign Ministry. Now, all of the, you don't need the Mossad in order to find that. Now, every NGO needs to be registered, needs to be accountable. Everyone can either go on the net or go into a certain office in Stockholm or in Geneva or wherever and ask to see the financial report of the NGO. You can find out where the money came from, where it went to. You can advertise it. You can take them to court. Many, many things that you can do and are not being done today. And finally, my emphasis is on the word center. Every campaign of this nature is being fought in the center and has to be won by the center in the center. It's not very useful that the response to extreme groups, then it becomes the two extremes. But what we want to win is the center of the intelligentsia, we want to win the center of the media, we want to win the center of public opinion around the world. And for this, we have to aim at the center and we have to operationalize the center. The problem, as usual, is that the silent majority is silent. Most faculty members do not agree with what a few individual faculty members do in Israeli universities. But what does that majority do? Nothing. They keep quiet. And therefore, what we need to do in that campaign is for the majority to speak up. It will make a major difference. Thank you.
Thank you. And now our second speaker, Ellen Dershowitz, and allow me, Ellen, to thank you on behalf of the Board of Governors, but on behalf of all of us and the professor in Tel Aviv University for what you are, the excellent job you are doing in defending Israel.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. What a great privilege it is to be on a podium with such great people, heroes of mine. Itamar reminded me of 1970 when we did the Advocates. It was my first trip to Israel, and what a trip. I came here to interview Golda Meir and to interview Moshe Dayan, interview a young man named Shimon Peres, who was then, I think, the Deputy Minister of Defense, and I made some of the best friends I've ever made in that trip 40 years ago this week. And I think about how the world should be praising Israel. Has any country in history ever contributed so much to the world in 62 years of existence? No. Think about it. Think of any other country in history. In 62 years, the amount of medical technology it has exported, the number of lives it has saved, what it did in Haiti, first responders, what it did in terms of modern technology. The world should be coming to Israel and saying, thank you, thank you, thank you, instead of constantly trying to delegitimate. The specter of countries like Greece and Ireland lecturing Israel on economy as to whether it should be admitted to the OECD was just remarkable. Ireland, practically a third world economy. Greece in the tank economically, telling Israel, well, maybe we'll sit in judgment over you and welcome you to our wonderful club. You know, the level of that club has increased so dramatically with Israel's admission. Its economic level, its technological level, its intellectual level. Again, the praise that Israel should be getting. Instead, we see this campaign of delegitimation, and it takes various forms. The first form is historical delegitimation, the narrative. The narrative, which portrays Israel as the aggressor and the Nazi and the human rights violator. The forgetfulness, the variation on Holocaust denial that's central to the anti-Israel critique. For example, you speak on college campuses and you mention the fact that during the Second World War, at the time when the decisions had to be made following the war about Israel's establishment, who was the leader of the Palestinian people? Haj al-Husseini, a Nazi, a man who spent the war years with Hitler. And you try to mention that on a college campus in order to show who's on which side. And you try to show the direct relationship between Husseini and some of the organizations today that seek Israel's delegitimation, and people just close their ears. It's as if you're talking on a different planet. I call it Planet Chomsky, where the worldview is so completely different. And then you have military delegitimation. It is such a clever, if it weren't such a horrible technique, such a clever technique. Again, I have a name for it. I call it Hamas's and Hezbollah's dead baby strategy. It sounds cruel, but it's very, very simple. The media, the most powerful image in the media is a mother holding a dead baby. Whether it be Jesus being held by Mary after the crucifixion, whether it be Guerrilla, Picasso's painting where you have mothers holding dead children. And what Hamas and Hezbollah know is that then when they fire enough rockets at Israeli children, at school buses, when they aim the rockets from 7 o'clock to 8 o'clock in the morning when school buses are on the way, when they hit schools, fortunately the principals had the foresight to release the students, they know eventually any democracy will have to respond. And how do you respond? You try to get the rocket firings. And where do they put the rockets? You wouldn't know it if you read the Goldstone report, but right in the middle of civilian populations. And the goal is to induce Israel to kill as many Palestinian babies as possible. That's the goal. The object is to have the Al Jazeera and the camera there to photograph the dead baby. I have to tell you an interesting story about that. So I had a debate on CNN during Cast Lead with a man named Zogby. He was a very good guy. And if he were trying to figure out the end game, we would have peace in a minute. But he's a very articulate opponent of Israel and defender of the Palestinian cause. We had this debate on Larry King. And if you read the transcript of the debate, it's clear that our side wins. And we had the moral clarity, we had the right position. But if you watch the debate on television, he wins. Why? Because every time I talked about how Israel makes efforts to reduce civilian casualties, and I made the intellectual argument, what did they show? They showed a mother with a dead baby on the screen. You can't hear what I'm saying when you see those powerful visual images. And Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran know that. As to which country in the world has the best record of protecting civilians, not the second or third or fourth best record, but the best record. And when the best is called the worst and the worst is called the best, nothing can be a greater defeat for human rights. So I'm here not only as a defender of Israel, but as somebody who's devoted my life to human rights and sees the distortion of human rights turned into human wrongs or human lefts because it becomes a weapon of the left to delegitimate Israel. And then we have this concept, guerrilla lawfare. I actually coined the phrase back in 1982 in a book, lawfare. And what is guerrilla lawfare? It's a form of legal terrorism. It's another form of asymmetrical warfare. It's a way for those who are weak militarily to try to regain the advantage in the court of law that they can't win on the battlefield or they can't win in any kind of honest debate or moral debate. And it's something that has to be responded to. Now, what's so hard about it, and Itamar made a point about it in the beginning, our greatest enemies are not the Islamic extremists. They help our case in many ways. I'll tell you a little story. I was at Irvine a year before Michael Oren was there, and there was a group like this, actually about 1,000, 1,200 people, and you could see some people on the one side were all wearing Palestinian garb and anti-Israel, and the other side there was some pro-Israel people, mostly from the right, actually. And there was the big center that I was aiming for. And so I said to the students there, I said, how many of you identify yourselves as pro-Israel? 100 hands went up. How many of you who are pro-Israel would accept a Palestinian state, non-terrorist, peaceful, living side by side? Every hand went up. Every hand. Then I turned to the pro-Palestinians and I said, how many of you would accept a non-expansionist, non-settling, Israel? And you could see them mumbling among each other and they couldn't make a decision. Not a single hand went up. The debate was over. The 800 people in the center saw that this wasn't pro-Israel versus pro-Palestine. It was pro-Israel, pro-Palestine versus anti-anti-anti. And we have to aim for the center. That is an absolutely key point. The problem is not the extremists. They help our case. The people who shout down Michael Oren help our case. The problem is Jews. Jews and Israelis. It's this article, it's this argument by ethnic identification. You get a man like, for example, Norman Finkelstein, who has never identified as a Jew. He's a fervent anti-Jew, in addition to being anti-Israel. Fervent anti-Jew, never identified as a Jew. But for purposes of attacking Israel, he says, I'm Jewish, and therefore you have to give me more credibility. You have a man like Gilad Atzmon, leaves Israel, goes to England, has become a full-fledged Holocaust denier, but he's a saxophonist and a prominent jazz musician, and he keeps his name, Gilad Atzmon, always regards himself as an Israeli. I mean, he made an apology recently. He said, you know, I used to compare Israel's military tactics to the Gestapo. He says, I'm sorry I said that. I want to apologize to the Gestapo. He said, Israel's actions are far worse, and it's insulting to Germany, and I will no longer use the Israel-Nazi comparison. Now, you know, that kind of argument, I think, even in Great Britain, they see through that kind of argument. But when you get somebody who strongly identifies as Jewish, even take, for example, J Street. A lot of things about J Street I can be sympathetic to, their desire to kind of help bring some young people. But now the head of J Street at Brandeis University leads the campaign against giving an honorary doctorate to Michael Oren. Brandeis University. They're, to the credit of Yehuda Reinhardt, the president, they're going to give the honorary doctorate to Michael Oren, but not without a great deal of difficulty, because the head of J Street at Brandeis, he didn't speak for J Street on this issue, but he does represent a trend among young people toward the delegitimation. And why don't they want Michael Oren to get an honorary doctorate? It's not because of Michael Oren. He's a nice guy. Everybody likes Michael Oren. He's a brilliant intellectual. He represents the state of Israel. This was an attempt to delegitimate Israel in the mind of Brandeis University. And if it's working, even to some degree at Brandeis, you can imagine how it works in other places. So we have to regain the initiative. We have to retake the narrative. We can't do it in a cowardly way. Now, I'm not going to suggest that David Benjamin, who's here, or that Eliezer Shkedi necessarily put their lives or their liberty at risk. What I am going to suggest is that the Israeli government ought to file a lawsuit, a declaratory judgment lawsuit, in the courts of England, seeking to make sure that these forms of universal jurisdiction can't continue to be abused the way they are currently abused. Israel has to fight back in every international forum available to it. It has to fight back at the International Criminal Court, in the International Court of Justice, in the UN, at the United Nations Human Rights Council. It has to stand up and engage. I think the days of not engaging, the days of, well, we'll legitimate them if we engage, I think that has proved to be a failure. And engagement is absolutely critical. You engage when you have the arguments on your side. You disengage when you're afraid of the arguments. You know, Israel may lose in some of these forums. They may lose the vote, but they will not lose the argument. And that is crucially important. And so I want to commend those of my colleagues on the panel who are fighting this good fight, and those of you who fight the good fight. I want to join Itamar in the call for centrists people. You know, you faculty members, if any of you are in this room, just one more point because I'm talking too long. When I speak on college campuses in the United States, I always get the same phone calls after I speak. The phone call goes like this: Alan, it's always in a whisper. Thank you so much for speaking up on behalf of Israel. I say, why won't you speak up on behalf of Israel? Well, you know, I support Israel, and the students know I support Israel, but I don't feel comfortable speaking up on behalf of Israel. Well, what is tenure? Tenure gives you not only the right to speak your conscience, it gives you the obligation to speak your conscience. Tenure carries a responsibility. And centrist professors and pro-Israel professors who remain silent in the face of extremism are failing in their responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Alan. So we are in a war, and if we are in a war, the soldiers in this battlefield are mainly people of our foreign ministry. And this is an opportunity to thank those who give the fight, Israeli ambassadors all over the world, and it's my pleasure to invite Daniel Taub to address us now. Daniel.
Thank you, Eyal. We've heard from Professors Rabinovich and Dershowitz some fascinating insights into what lies behind some of the delegitimization that we've been experiencing and some directions that we should be thinking about. I've been working for about 20 years as a legal advisor in Israel's Foreign Service, and over that period of time, the nature of my job has changed. I originally signed up as an international lawyer to try and be one of the architects of peace agreements between Israel and its neighbors. And I spent many years doing that. But if I think about most of my work over the last decade, it's been far less devoted to building peace and far more to fighting, as Eyal said, a fight for Israel in a new arena, which is the international legal arena. And the question that I ask myself is, how is it that this international legal arena has become so hostile? What actually happened? What lies behind the change? And I think there are a number of things. A number of them we've already heard. One of them, quite simply, is the changing nature of the armed conflicts in which we find ourselves. That we now find ourselves, as we've heard, fighting an adversary like Hamas, like Hezbollah, who not only doesn't accept upon themselves the basic humanitarian principles of distinguishing between combatants and civilians, of principles of proportionality, but actually uses those principles as some kind of shield to hide behind. You know, hiding weapons launchers in the basements of homes and hospitals, ignoring warning leaflets and actually using those as an excuse to bringing in additional civilians into the areas. And I think that's simply a fact that we have to recognize. Secondly, a point that hasn't been made so far, the actors on the international plane have changed. We're no longer talking about an international arena that is composed primarily of states, but now we have new and often problematic voices, like those of the non-governmental organizations, the NGOs. And to see the increasing power of NGOs and other non-governmental bodies, you can actually do a simple test. It's called the Skyline Test. Take any Western city and ask yourself, what were the tallest buildings on the skyline in the year 1800? And you'll find that invariably these were the churches. These were the steeples because that's where the power was concentrated. Ask yourself, which were the tallest buildings in the year 1900? And those were the Reichstag, the Big Ben. They were the parliamentary buildings because the power was concentrated in the hands of the government. But go to any Western city in the year 2000, the year 2010, and you'll find that the tallest buildings on the horizon are not governmental buildings, not religious institutions. They are the non-governmental organizations, the multilateral corporations, the multinational corporations, and so on. The power has become far more diffuse, and this creates a far more difficult scenario for us to deal with. We're talking about organizations which have a halo effect, but which are very single-minded, are frequently funded by interested parties. It's interesting, I do a certain amount of spokesmanship for Israel on the media, and it's a long time since I've been involved in a debate where on the other side of the debate attacking Israel is actually a Palestinian representative. Invariably today, if you're in a debate against Israel, about Israel, on the other side of the debate will be a representative of a so-called human rights organization or a United Nations agency, because that central ground of these organizations has been monopolized, has been instrumentalized. A third thing, I think, is if we're talking about the United Nations, we can see, unfortunately, a troubling phenomenon. And we can see an expanding circle of politicization. As far as Israel is concerned, the United Nations is a wonderful institution, but a terrible organization. It's a wonderful institution because genuinely it's remarkable that every state in the world can sit side by side, although you should know even that takes a certain amount of fiddling. I don't know if you know that within the UN you sit according to alphabetical order. And so that means that in theory Israel should actually be sitting next to the Islamic Republic of Iran. We should actually be neighbors there. But the UN realized that this wasn't a great idea. So within the UN system, Iran is actually called Iran, open bracket, Islamic Republic of, close brackets. So we have the poor Irish who are stuck there as some sort of buffer zone between us and the Iranians. But in practice, the UN is a very problematic organization. We know that Israel still today is the only country that is not allowed full membership in any one of the regional groupings of the UN, which are the basis for election to high office and consultations. And more to the point, it's a one state, one vote organization, which means that on any resolution relating to the Middle East, all the Arab states, the Muslim states, and what are called the non-aligned states will vote one way, and all the Jewish states will vote the other way. And the results are more or less a foregone conclusion. Now, the trend that I think is troubling is this. Until about 30 or 40 years ago, that automatic majority, that leverage, was basically limited to the political organs of the United Nations, the General Assembly. Some of you will remember in the 1970s, the vote Zionism is racism and so on. During the 80s and 90s, we saw a deliberate attempt to expand that circle of influence to the human rights and humanitarian organs of the international community. That was the period of time when we saw, for example, the human rights bodies in Geneva become the total travesty of human rights protection they are today. A travesty in which every human rights violation in the world is dealt with under one agenda item, and Israel has the unique privilege of having an agenda item all of its own. To date, the Human Rights Council has passed more resolutions hostile to Israel, had more special sessions condemning Israel than every other country in the world combined. And if you think about that, the victims of that politicization are not Israel. The victims are those victims of human rights abuses elsewhere in the world who never get their day in the spotlights because we have all these tyrannical regimes who are only too pleased to turn the spotlights of attention away from themselves. But what's troubling to me as a lawyer is what's happened over the last decade or two. And that's an expansion of this circle of politicization still further to a third arena. And that is the legal and judicial organs of the international community. We've seen it, as we heard, with the phenomenon of what's called universal jurisdiction, Israelis who are in danger of being arrested and put on trial almost anywhere in the world. We've seen it with the politicization of a very important institution called the International Criminal Court, a permanent war crimes tribunal which Israel was in favor of, but which became grossly politicized by the Arab group. And for me personally, one of the saddest moments of my professional career was being in Rome at the time of the adoption of the Statute of the Court, and hearing the head of our delegation, a wonderful judge, Judge Eli Natan, a great humanitarian and a Holocaust survivor, stand up and explain that Israel would not be able to become party to the court. And we see it also, not just in institutions, but in a dilution of crucial principles of international law. NGOs and UN bodies that are presenting international law in a grossly irresponsible way. During the conflict in Gaza, we had a statement by the Secretary General of the United Nations, who said that Israel could take any measures it required to protect the lives of its civilians, as long as these had no impact on the lives of Palestinians. Now that's a wonderful United Nations statement. It sounds marvelously even-handed, but it is a total misrepresentation of international law. There is no principle of international law that says when you are faced with weapons being fired from the heart of areas and the authorities there are doing nothing to stop it, you can take no measures whatsoever. Measures have to be proportionate. They have to be lawful. And my fear is that international law is being presented in a way which is quite simply unworkable. And I say this as an international lawyer in the system, part of whose job is to turn round and to be an advocate of international law to our political leaders and our military leaders. And we simply cannot afford to undermine international law in this way. You know, some months ago I met with a very eminent group of international jurists who came to write a report on the Gaza conflict. And after hearing about an hour or so of their criticism, I said to them, look, you're a very eminent group of international jurists. You've traveled to conflict situations all around the world. Can you please tell me, now that you've seen the threat that we faced, what, in your view, would be a lawful or proportionate response? And I was met with 4 or 5 minutes of total silence, until finally the head of the delegation said, well, that, of course, is an acontextual question. So I said, what sort of context can I provide you with that will help you address the question? But he was not prepared, nor was any of his members of his delegation, to get involved in the muddy business of rolling up their sleeves and thinking, what does it mean to actually implement these principles in practice? And to my mind, if you're not prepared to get involved in that exercise, you lose your standing to engage in the debate. So what do? I think we heard the beginnings of some very, very important suggestions from Professors Rabinovich and Dershowitz. I'd like to add just a couple of others that I think are guiding us in our thinking. The first is that we have to recognize that delegitimization is not a blank check. The fact that we are being delegitimized does not mean that we have not to hold ourselves to the highest standards in everything we do, including in excruciating dilemmas in armed conflicts. And it's absolutely crucial that when things fall below the standards that we expect of ourselves, we investigate them thoroughly and prepare to prosecute. At the moment, we have 150 investigations going on into allegations of less than ideal behavior in the course of the armed conflict. We're doing this not because of the Goldstone report, we're doing it despite the Goldstone report. But it's absolutely crucial that we hold fast to those standards. Secondly, I think it's absolutely crucial that we engage. We actually engage with the international community, even though frequently we have painful dilemmas. There's a balance between influencing the outcome and giving legitimacy to initiatives that are clearly political. But we have to realize that the more that we engage, the more that we reach out, the more we will have the opportunity, if you like, to divide and conquer and to point at the illegitimacy of those unique situations which really are beyond the pale. The next thing we have to educate. I've spent a certain amount of time on campuses in Europe and in the United States. And I think, like Professor Dershowitz, the thing that has troubled me most is not the hostility of those who are against us, but the ignorance and the fear of Jews and those who should be generally our allies. And we have to reach out to them, we have to educate them. We have a new program which we've started, led by the Foreign Ministry, to reach out to our potential allies, to provide them with tools, to provide them with support, to invite them to conferences here and so on and so forth, is something that we simply can't afford not to do. The other thing is we have to build alliances more broadly. We have to actually reach out. As part of this program, we are funding, supporting young students that are going to be internees in international tribunals. We're increasing the number of legal dialogues and so on and so forth. We simply can't afford not to create alliances. And we need to, absolutely rightly, as it's been said before, the problem with the silent majority is that it's silent, and we need to find a way of making it vocal. And the last point that I think I would make, which hasn't been made so far, is that there is a lot of energy out there, particularly amongst young people, that is being diverted into hostile activity that we need to divert into constructive activity. Not the hard core of the hostility to Israel, but many of the young people that are surrounding that don't know what to do and feel a desire to try and help the conflict in some way, to try and help the Middle East. And it's absolutely crucial that we find positive channels in which this energy can be directed. You know, I was the head for a couple of years of a channel of negotiations with the Palestinians. It was called the Culture of Peace Negotiations, but it dealt, amongst other things, with the issue of incitement in Palestinian school books and on children's television. And I think I came to something of a realization why it was so hard for the Palestinians to take this stuff out of their school books. And I think in large part it's because, unfortunately, they have very little to replace it with. That we're talking about a Palestinian national identity which to a great degree is predicated on a sense of glorification of martyrdom, of hostility and victimhood. And it made me realize that as Israelis we have a strategic interest in the development of a positive Palestinian national identity. Because only if there is some sort of yes out there will the Palestinian people have the strength to say no to the negative elements in their society? I think the same thing is going on our campuses at the moment, that we have to try and provide positive channels of involvement. And I think academia is an absolutely crucial place to start. I think we have a tremendous amount to offer as Israel, and I think academia has a tremendous amount to offer. Young people who are concerned, who have the passion, who have the will, who have the talents, and our job has to be to try and find channels in which not only do they not act in a way that undermines basic freedoms and the chances of peace in the Middle East, but they actually move them forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. And now it's your turn. I do suggest we'll collect some questions or comments, and then the speakers will address them. So who is first? Please, go ahead, and if possible, speak loud, okay?
Yeah. My name is John Burkoff.
I think we can hear you.
Okay, is that better?
Yeah.
My name is John Gurkoff. I'm from New Jersey. I'm on the Board of Governors. Before I comment, I want to mention to Professor Dershowitz, I disagree with one of the things you said, and that is you apologize for speaking so long. We would rather you spoke longer. Okay? Professor Rabinovich mentioned something about Eyal being at the end of the terminal. This subtle visage is something we see every day. And just this morning, I was watching CNN, and they had the World Weather Report on. And it showed every major city in the world, every capital in the Western Hemisphere, in Europe, North and Africa, all the Middle Eastern countries except for Israel. It did not have Jerusalem, did not have Tel Aviv. This is CNN in the United States. It's owned by a company in the United States, and I am so upset when I see these ways of delegitimizing Israel. And it happens every day, and we have to do something about it. The second thing I want to mention is that there's things that I call true lies, and we see them every day. That means that the things that are told over and over and over again that we know not to be true, but because they're told over and over again, they become true. There was a report on Syrian television that about Haiti and about Israel and Haiti, where Israel was going to Haiti to get people and murder babies to get organs. And this is shown all over Europe, shown all over Al Jazeera, and it's an outrage. But there are things that in our own country, which I don't know if Professor Dershowitz can address this, but in our State Department, and this affects this university, in our State Department, there is a travel advisory about Israel, and it's preventing students from coming to this country to go to school, and also, obviously, to Tel Aviv University. Students can apply to schools in Syria, Jordan, Egypt, and go there without a problem. They have a very difficult time going to the United States or going to Israel. What can you do? What can we do to change that at the State Department? This is more than just a subtle thing. This is more than just lies. This is something that directly affects our university, and what can we do about it?
Thank you. Who is next here? Yeah, okay, please. Okay.
Good morning. My name is Bernard Lazarus, now of Tel Aviv, previously South Africa. Now, I've listened carefully, like all of us, to the brilliant analyses of our current position. However, with respect, I feel no real positive solutions have been suggested. And I wish to make 2 points only. Very briefly, on the national level, I think it is deplorable that a country which has 30 ministers, which is more than most countries have, has not got a full-time Ministry of Information. The Hasbara that comes out of Israel is non-existent, is spasmodic, and not on an ongoing basis. It is essential that we have a Ministry of Information headed by a man who is knowledgeable, of course, fluent in English, and puts the case of Israel on a daily basis, because there is no other way. And incidentally, such a person, in my view, has to be a populist speaker. Now, this sounds perhaps a bit strange in an academic institution, but the bulk of the population is more influenced by the eloquence of a speaker rather than by his legal arguments. Now, that's point one. Point two, we are here at a university, and I'm dealing with Tel Aviv, all the universities, infiltrated by traitors, by people who are working for Hamas, who are working for Hezbollah and Ahmadinejad. We have here lecturers, professors, call it what you like, probably second-rate intellectuals, but nevertheless, those are the people who propose to boycott, disinvest, and do all these things to Israel. The harm these people do, you cannot calculate. They may be few numbers, but ask the campuses in America. I have grandchildren there. Ask any campuses. Jewish students today are frightened to put the Jewish case because of the influence of these Israelis. Just one example, then I'll keep quiet. Months ago, when Trondheim considered boycotting Israeli universities, I met the ambassador of Norway here. And he said, you know, I don't understand it. Israelis are telling us to boycott the universities in Israel. What goes on here? I think the very first step we must do is take action against those employees of ours who are the agents for our enemies. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Let me just make a comment. We have it's a debate here in Tel Aviv University. There are people who are wrong. Let's consider them as people who make mistakes and not use these, words of traitors and agents of Hamas. There is a debate here. We should give the fight. We should convince them they are wrong. But the next speaker, yes, the next question, yes, please.
Yeah, I think that my name is Zisser. I'm full professor at Tel Aviv University and also a member of the executive committee. Coming from the faculty of biology, I think that one point that is problematic with addressing the center, as Professor Rabinovich has proposed, is that we are not doing anything emotional. We need to speak to the emotion of people and not to the logic. One emotional point that I would like to maybe propose may sound a bit crazy at the beginning. We are an endangered species. We are. And we are threatened to be actually exterminated from Iran, for example. There is an organization of the UN in Switzerland that takes 126 delegates from different countries and actually is protecting the nature and protecting endangered species. Why don't we go there and ask, look, it's crazy, but why are we less than panda bears? Did you ever think about it? If you were like Alan Dershowitz told us, we brought so much to the world in terms of culture. Why are not we entitled to be a preserved entity or species? And then I think there will be no left-wing person in the world that will really tell us that we cannot defend ourselves.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, the mic is there, so we'll... Another two... yeah, okay. I see... Yeah. Hannah, okay, if you want to make it... Yeah. Just a minute. Yeah. Let us give Hannah Wirtner, Professor Hannah Wirtner, the floor, and then another... Yeah, we'll get to all of you. Yes, please, Hannah.
I'm a faculty member at Tel Aviv University. You can't hear?
Louder, Hannah.
Louder? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm a professor at Tel Aviv University. I immigrated to Israel 25 years ago, and I hear your pain. I hear your pain, and I recognize it because it's in myself, and that is that there are colleagues of mine expressing opinions that we feel in our guts and that are extremely painful to us, and this is a trauma for us. However, we also heard from the podium today that we have to hold up the highest standards for ourselves in physical combat and in verbal and intellectual. I did not come from the United States in order to be at the University of Tehran. I came here, I'm proud of Tel Aviv University because we have academic freedom here, and this is what makes us a great university. Professor Dershowitz said at the honorary doctoral ceremony that, you know, we can be Harvard. We can be the Harvard of the Middle East. We can be that Harvard. We cannot use punitive measures to prevent people from presenting views that we even feel in our deepest guts is extremely painful to us, because if we want this to be a great university and a great country, we have to maintain that freedom of expression. And the last thing I want to say is that Professor Dershowitz said wisely, and I thank you for it, that it's the open market of ideas that at the end of the day that will save us. And that's what we have to preserve.
Thank you, Hannah. Now, since we are running out of time, please make your comments as short and brief as possible. Okay, we'll take a few more comments and then we need to leave. Yeah. Okay. Where is the mic? Okay.
Hello. Hi. My name is Selena Goran. I grew up in Italy in the 70s and 80s with an Israeli passport. It wasn't a happy place. We have never been, maybe in the 70s, the kibbutz movement, but we've never been as sexy, let's say, as a cause as the Palestinians, that are better victims, I guess, than we managed to be. And it's sad to see that Jews around the world are losing, their voices in support for Israel. But I think the important thing is for us to find our advantage. And our advantage is not going around the world and saying, no, we are the victims, and not trying to defend ourselves against all these people with their crazy ideas. I think our advantage is to find a way to give the Palestinians a state, make peace, and then we won't have the problem anymore.
Okay. The gentleman here. Yeah, if you can. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Okay.
Hi. My name is Guillermo Sverdlin. 27 years ago, I came from Mexico to live in Israel. And I'm entitled, working inside the Tel Aviv University, and I'm chairman of the Spanish-speaking Friends of Tel Aviv University. I was reading this, and I want to ask you, what do you think about the academic freedom? The academics, as employees of Tel Aviv University, should not be entitled to harm the university by signing petitions with one hand while receiving a salary from it with the other hand. Sounds very, very hard. Tel Aviv University has the right to protect itself from those who act against its legitimacy and cynically abuse the purported academic freedom. How can you solve this problem? Because we need the academic freedom and we need the Tel Aviv University. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we need to give the speakers, time to address these issues, and let's leave it as it is. I mean, because it's an... So, Itamar, you will be... אתה לא רוצה לענות
We spoke a lot about, call it the technicalities of the debate. We have to spend at least a couple of minutes talking about substance, the policy. Now, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and now, unfortunately, the Iranian-Israeli conflict are not going to be resolved anytime soon. This is not something that will be over in a year or two. And we need to think not only on how to train better speakers, how to be more effective on television, how to make the fact known that we actually do have a Minister of Information who manages to hide himself very effectively. We do. But 2 points. One is that we need to revive a peace process. We need to revive a peace process, not at any cost, but the solution to this conflict has to be a peaceful solution. There will not be a military solution to this conflict. Israel cannot win ever a total victory. And at the end of the day, there has to be a peace process. This is not a great time for the peace process. We have an 800-pound gorilla in the arena called Iran, and nobody wants to take that gorilla on, beginning with the Obama administration and moving on to European countries. And it's not easy to conduct a peace process. We have a modest beginning now, and we should invest more in bringing Daniel Taub to being a peace negotiator rather than fighting in the ICC. So when there is a peace process going, it's much easier to defend the Israeli case. So yes, no, I didn't say that. When you have a peace process, in the 90s, when we had a full-fledged peace process negotiating several Arab countries, it was much easier to defend Israel around the world when many Arabs were talking to Israel at the same time. So it is in our interest, not at any cost, to revive a peace process. Secondly, when you have to do something, try to be smart. Let me use one example, is what we call the fence, the barrier. There's no question that we had to set up the barrier. We all remember the horrible days of suicide bombings in Tel Aviv and other places in Israel. There are no suicide bombers in recent years, largely because there is a fence. And I don't think we want to dispute the fact that it was a very wise, legitimate idea to build that fence. But it could have been done in a smarter way. So when we take measures to defend ourselves, we should be smarter about the way we do that. We have to remember that the CNN camera, where the issue of where the CNN camera is, particularly in an asymmetrical conflict, is not less important than where the mortar or the gun is. Because today, part of the war is the war over media. Now, two challenges. One is to the Jewish people. Al Jazeera was mentioned. Al Jazeera was created by a tiny country called Qatar. It's hardly a country. It's very rich. You know, they just bought Harrods. They have almost unlimited resources, but it takes more than money. To put together a television station. I'm sure Ellen and I have been in many conversations in the last 2 decades about creating a global Jewish television network. The money is there. Enough wealthy Jewish persons around the world who can put up the money that the Qataris have put into that money. The Qataris created the Doha debates. It's now on international television. They are adopting the British debating rules and are using that to their advantage. Can the Jewish people not do that? So let's identify a challenge. Let's say that we would like to exert an effort so that in 2 or 3 years there's going to be an English language international Jewish network television that will help us fight the PR war, the image war, the anti-delegitimization war around the world. Second, something that concerns Tel Aviv University but is relevant to all other Israeli universities. As you know, we are going to build new dormitories here, just south of this structure. When we started planning for these dormitories, one of the ideas was to make it a place where there will not be 600, 700, or 800 students from around the world studying at Tel Aviv University, but to have 3,000 or 4,000 students coming from around the world, most of them Jewish, not only Jewish, to study at Tel Aviv University. The idea was that there would be summer sessions. Now, we spoke about the legal arena. We spoke about the human rights arena. How many young Jewish students go to law schools in America and Europe? Thousands? Tel Aviv University, Hebrew University, University of Haifa, all have first-class law schools. We should have summer sessions in the dormitories, coming for a month, coming for 6 weeks, training to participate in these human rights debates, teaching them the nature, the shifting nature of the debate, and to becoming advocates for Israel when they are students, when they become practicing lawyers, when they become professors of law. This is what I mean by learning what the new rules of the game in the international arena are, training for them, and playing them effectively, and the universities like ours, but other universities in Israel have both an opportunity and a duty in this regard. Thank you.
I think it's crucially important to distinguish between criticism on the one hand and delegitimation on the other. I was distressed to hear some negative reactions to a very good question asked about peace. I don't believe necessarily that peace will bring an end to Israel's problems, but there must be room for criticism and debate. And you're not anti-Israel if you're critical of the settlements. You're not anti-Israel if you're in favor of the divided Jerusalem. You're not anti-Israel if you believe that Israel made many serious mistakes in Operation Cast Lead. And every university should encourage the kinds of criticism that make the university a place of intellectual rigor. There is a very sharp distinction between the kind of legitimate criticism that ought to be encouraged and actions like boycotting your own university. Now, one problem that I have, of course, is as somebody who has been in the front lines of the free speech issue for 45 years in the United States, I'm not smart enough to draw lines. I'm just not smart enough. I don't know how to draw a line that would permit firing of a professor who goes over a certain point and one who does not. I've never understood, for example, I got much criticism when I defended the right of Nazis to march through Skokie. Why did I do that? I hate Nazis. I did it because I loved Martin Luther King. And I understood that you couldn't have a rule that prevented Nazis from marching in Skokie that also wouldn't prevent Martin Luther King from marching in Birmingham, Alabama. It's very hard to draw those lines. And even when one talks about, for example, boycotting universities. Again, my grandmother would start out by saying lahavdil, so I want to say lahavdil right away because I'm not making any analogies. But all of us would have been supportive of brave German professors in the 1930s who wanted to boycott Heidelberg University and wanted to boycott Berlin University. We would have, I think, all been proud of university professors at Wits University in South Africa who wanted to boycott universities that practice segregation. Now, we understand the difference between an Israeli university on the one hand and a German university or South African university, but there are many out there who don't. And therefore, you may have to, in order to make sure that academic freedom thrives in the context of criticism, extend it to the context where we are all horribly uncomfortable. Now, I have to tell you, the people who call for boycotts are a bunch of cowards. Let me tell you why they're cowards. If they believe that it's proper to boycott Tel Aviv University, they should start by boycotting Tel Aviv University and resign in protest. That, it seems to me, is the courageous approach. That's what I would do. When Harvard at one point in time looked like it would be excluding a Jewish dean from becoming a dean of Harvard, I offered my resignation. I said, I'm not going to stay with a university that practices discrimination against Jews, or a university that practices discrimination against blacks or gays or anybody else. That's the courageous thing to do, to leave the university, not to go to England or doing what two professors from Tel Aviv University are doing literally this week. Professor Giora and I forget the name of the other. They're in Boston trying to shut down an exhibit at Boston Museum of Science, which truthfully demonstrates Israel's commitment to medical technology and environment technology. That is censorship, pure and simple. Now, we know, because I grew up, came of age when I was defending the rights of communists who wouldn't defend my rights and who would shut down everything if they got into power, but we had to defend the rights of communists. So I have to defend the rights of censorial Stalinists like Yora. Yeah, I'm going to use those terms. I'm sorry. I'm going to use those terms because I think free speech requires definite and direct honesty. And a person who's trying to shut down an exhibit is a Stalinist. And the people who try to prevent Tel Aviv University from hiring a woman who had a distinguished record for human rights in the Judge Advocate General Corps and try to prevent her from being hired at Tel Aviv University while proclaiming their own free speech are hypocritical Stalinists. And what they're trying to do is turn Tel Aviv University into Pravda. Now, we still have to defend their rights, and we have to defeat them in the marketplace of ideas. Where I gently disagree with my dear friend Itamar, and I agree with him completely that Israel ought to make peace, Israel, in my view, ought to end the settlements, Israel ought to do a great many things, I do not believe that will end the delegitimation effort of Israel. I do think that the delegitimation effort has now moved back to 1948. That it's not 1967. When I debate on college campuses, the slogans are, all of Palestine will be free from the Jordan to the sea, you know, that kind of thing. We will help the case of Israel by making peace. The case for Israel will be helped dramatically, but you notice that when Israel was in the process of trying to make peace in 2000, 2001 at Taub and at Camp David, that was the moment where the greatest movements toward boycotts and divestment in England, particularly in France, occurred. It's when Israel makes peace often that they're seen as most vulnerable. So peace is a good thing to make in and of itself. Ending some practices that Israel engages in, smarter approaches to the security barrier, all of those are good. They're good for Israel. They're good for the world. They're good for human rights. But they are not going to solve the problem. You're going to still have to be working very hard, because the next step is going to be that Israel was illegitimate when it was established. Israel was illegitimate in 1967 before the war, and that campaign has to be thought about. Now, in terms of starting a television channel, Al Jazeera, this relates very much. Let me tell you why we haven't done that. I've been trying to push this for a long, long time. And you're right, there's a lot of people with a lot of money in the United States. But they also have very strong opinions. And they all want the television channel to represent precisely their point of view. It's like my mother. My mother, who died a year and a half ago, was a modern Orthodox Jew. She couldn't stand the Haredim. They were too far to the right. And she didn't like conservatives. They were too far to the left. She knew exactly what it meant to be a Jew, to be her. And if you moved at all in any way from her definition, there was something very wrong. And the problem is that I think Al Jazeera has been brilliant. They are a very good television station. They are excellent. I was asked to be on an interview with David Frost. You know Frost Nixon? So there was Frost Dershowitz. And he called on me to try to debate torture. And I figured that they would edit it and cut it out. And I said, look, I'll go on and be interviewed by David Frost, who's a great interviewer, only if you promise not to edit a single word. And they promised. And so they said, well, why does Israel torture? So I said, let me talk about torture. Let's talk about torture in the order in which it's practiced. I said, you're going to give me 10 minutes to talk about torture? So I spent 9 3/4 minutes talking about Jordan, Egypt, Syria, Hamas, Hezbollah, all the organizations that torture. And I said, now let's turn to Israel. That's where they belong in the last half a minute of a 10-minute. And he kept it on the air. Al Jazeera has given me fairer interviews in many respects than other stations, other channels. And if a Jewish or pro-Israel television channel is going to operate, it must be independent, and it must annoy the heck out of many of you who are annoyed that there isn't a weather report about Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. You won't like a good you can't have it both ways. You can't have a television station that really works that you like. Inevitably, there's going to have to be the trade-off between independence and academics being involved, and it being a little bit like PBS or a little bit like BBC, a little bit like Al Jazeera, and also making the case for Israel, which is why we have to learn to live with J Street. We have to learn to live with other organizations that don't necessarily reflect all of our points of view. It's very difficult. But as Itamar said very early on, I just want to repeat it and then stop. We cannot make this into a left-right issue. We can't make it into the extremes on the left hate Israel, and the best and most vocal defenders of Israel are the extreme right. We have to move the debate more toward the center. We have to encourage criticism. We have to maintain academic freedom. These are not easy or black and white issues, and we have to learn to live with ambiguity, difficulty. The struggle for justice never stays won. The Torah says, tzedek, tzedek, tirdof. Not just wait and see if it happens. You must actively pursue it. And the case for Israel will never be won. It'll never be won. It'll always be a process. The search for truth is a process. And we have to engage in that process more aggressively and more actively, but we're not going to win in black. There are no simple solutions like firing a professor here and there. There are rules. We might be able to establish a rule. Let me give you an idea of one constructive rule. Tel Aviv University would have a right to say that when professors speak ex cathedra, beyond their disciplines, outside, on television, about issues that they don't speak for the university on, that they should not be able to identify themselves as professor of Tel Aviv University. Harvard already has that rule. It's not an easy rule. It's not an easy rule, because it would apply also to pro-Israel professors. It would apply to everybody. But it is a neutral rule, and it's one that I think would be consistent with academic freedom. There are other rules like that that people could think about, but any rule has to not violate the principle, free speech for me but not for thee. It has to always be neutral. That's the essence of academic freedom, and that's the essence of, I think, liberal democracy.
So much has been said, and it's been said so well that I'll satisfy myself just with a couple of points. First of all, John was asking about the role of the media. I'm often asked, is the media anti-Israel? Is the media anti-Palestinian? I'll tell you, I think the media is anti-peace. And the reason I say that is that when I was the head of a track of negotiations on culture of peace issues, I was frequently contacted by journalists who would say, can you share what's going on inside the negotiating room? And I would say, no, we have instructions not to talk about what's going on in the negotiating room. But in the course of my work, I've come across remarkable individuals on both sides of the divide, bereaved people, youngsters who are reaching out to each other in all sorts of remarkable ways. Maybe you can write a story about this. And again, the response that I got was, nobody wants to read about good Israelis and good Palestinians. And it's really tragic, because there aren't so many points of light out there that we can actually afford to ignore that sort of ripple effect. Selina asked about the question of whether we can resolve the delegitimization issues by simply coming to a political solution, and there was an interesting interchange between the two professors. But I'll be honest, I think I look at it the other way round. Not whether reaching a peace agreement will help deal with the problem of delegitimization. I think the opposite. I think addressing the problem of delegitimization will actually help us reach a peace agreement. And one of the things that is so frustrating to me is the obsessive, one-sided dealing with this issue, particularly in international fora, in the United Nations and so on, creates a magnetic attraction for the Palestinians away from the negotiating table. We have had decades of hostile resolutions against Israel that haven't brought the Palestinians one iota closer to their ambitions. We had a few years of face-to-face negotiations, and they caused dramatic changes for the Palestinian people. So I think we really need to address the issues of delegitimization, not separately from the issue of the peace, because we need to do that in order to get to peace. And the final point I'd make, particularly when there's so many people here who come from abroad, I think there actually is a difference between the nature of delegitimization abroad and here in our region. And unfortunately, most of the winds of extremism at the moment are coming from outside our region. You know, I was involved in the early rounds of negotiations between Israel and Palestinians, where we had to learn that on the other side of the table there were different people represented. There were the Palestinians who had grown up in the territories. There were the PLO leadership who had flown back in from exile in Tunis. And invariably there were Palestinian diaspora academics who had been shipped in from Yale or Harvard or whatever to advise the Palestinian delegation. And invariably, they were the hardest people to reach an agreement with, because they had the most to lose in terms of their diaspora dreams. And still today, most of the winds advancing the idea of a single-state solution, pushing in the direction of extremism, failing to make any distinctions whatsoever on the Palestinian side of the equation between extremists and moderates. I was at a campus on the west coast of the United States where there was a demonstration against me. And I said to the demonstrators, I showed them a short clip that I had on my laptop, which was a shocking clip, which maybe some of you have seen, of a Palestinian, a Hamas terrorist who needs to cross a road. And he has a weapon on his back, and in order to cross this road where he'll be exposed, you actually see him picking up a Palestinian kid who's maybe 7 or 8 years old, holding him in front of him as he crosses to the other side of the road. And so I said to the demonstrators, I said, I don't think it's wrong that you're pro-Palestinian. I think Palestinians need support from abroad. But I want to know which of those two Palestinians you're supporting. Are you supporting the Hamas terrorist, or are you supporting that kid who is going to grow up without the possibility of even envisaging a different sort of environment? And I think that's why it's so crucial that we actually do engage in this debate abroad. And maybe finally just one slight point of maybe hope on the horizon, and though it's a strange sort of comfort. One of the advantages, the perverse advantages of delegitimization is that expectations of Israel are so low. And it is so easy to change preconceived notions. That's why it's absolutely crucial for us to get out there. It's absolutely crucial for places like Tel Aviv University to bring in people like the summer program. There's already a wonderful master's program, which I've had some involvement in, which is doing a wonderful job educating people abroad. And really, I just hope that Tel Aviv University goes Mechail al Chayil from strength to strength. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. With this, our session comes to its end. It's a slow and difficult process, but I think we made here the first move. Thank you very much, and see you next year.
Thank you.